Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Espresso with Carlo today. Now, people ask, do I actually drink espresso when I do this? So I think you could see it. I do drink espresso, probably too many. And I'm glad, Andrew, you have your coffee. But it's a pleasure to see everybody. We took a couple of weeks off on espressos, and we're back today on what I think is probably one of the most critical issues facing not just New York, which is what we're going to talk about today, but really the global economy. We're very excited to have our special guest today. Let me start first by thanking Bravo, Ihab Shihada. Ihab, thank you for your leadership and your friendship and for supporting our event today. So today we're joined by Andrew Rein. Andrew is the president of the Citizens Budget Commission. And before I tell you a little bit about Andrew, but looking at the guests on our show today, many of you know Andrew very well. We went through COVID and we went through a really critical time from early March and continuing today, right? The cases go up, they go down, they're up a little bit, they're back down today. But I think one of the stories behind all of this is how it has affected the economy of the world. And for us in New York, whether we are a small business owner, whether we run a nonprofit, whether we just get up and go to work in the morning, we are all going to face issues with the budget of New York City and New York State. And many of you keep asking, what do we do? How can we plan? What should we be doing? And that's why we thought of having Andrew on today. Andrew has 25 years experience in public and social finances and services. He's a leader in nonprofit and public organizations. He served as associate director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where he led development of the United States' first ever national prevention strategy and the health reform portfolio. He also served as his executive deputy commissioner and chief operating officer of the New York City Health Department, where he oversaw its $1.6 billion annual budget. He was also a senior vice president for strategy of both Emblem Health and NYU Lutheran, a senior policy advisor to the New York School's chancellor. Andrew, I can go on, but it's interesting from your resume. I can't think of a better person in your position right now, given your health background, your finance background, and I know we share a love for the great borough of Brooklyn as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome Andrew Rein to Espresso with Carlo. Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll do a little dialogue.
Well, thanks so much, Carlo, for having me, and for being for the Building Congress to be such an essential part of the fabric of New York, and for your work there. It's wonderful, and for encouraging me to get a midday coffee. I appreciate
Nothing wrong with a midday coffee.
Supporting Madman. I'll put in a plug for Madman Espresso next to our office, but mostly a plug for all the small businesses around New York. We reopened our office, and I'm glad every day, on a voluntary basis, of course, but I'm glad every day when we can support New Yorkers. And I'm now in our library since I can't be in my office because the construction outside my window is so loud, but that's a great sign. So that's my problem. So yeah, this is a heck of a time. We have a pandemic, a health crisis that generates, as we shut down the economy, an economic crisis that of course cascades into a fiscal crisis for New York State, New York City, and the MTA. So we really have this incredibly difficult situation. And while all three of those public entities need federal funds, deserve federal funds, and I think there's discussions maybe as we speak here. I didn't look at my Twitter feed more than 35 minutes ago, but there are discussions today. All these governments need federal funds. We'll see how much and what comes, and I'm cautiously optimistic something sometime. But how the region pulls out, manages through this recession and pulls out of it, depends on the choices our leaders make. They can make some hard, important, strong choices to preserve core services and ride through this crisis if they do it smartly. Or you can make some easier choices and burden the future with bills that it can't pay or services that are inadequate. Because if we don't have the kind of social, economic, fiscal infrastructure and and governments at all these three entities, we will not be able to educate our kids, get to work, pick up the trash, and be the dynamic, creative city that we are. That is what's helped New York for 300 years. That people want to come here, they want to raise their family here, they want their businesses here. We have to create that atmosphere, but it might look different. So we're in a fiscal crisis in all three of these governments. We have choices to make, and how we make those choices will really set the stage on our future trajectory.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I do want to start with one thing, and we'll talk about the bigger borrowing and all that in a minute. But yesterday I took advantage of indoor dining and had lunch with two of our members in Midtown, and it seemed better than it had been, and there were people out and about, but clearly not where a beautiful, bright end of September day should be in New York. And I think, your organization, the Building Congress, there are ABNY, there's REBNY, there's the partnership, there's our members, so many members, so many organizations that are trying to figure out what's the best way to get people back to work, back into the city. Before we talk about the budget and the things that kind of let us lose sleep at night, I'm curious to get your point on that, because you're a New Yorker, right? You love the city. What should we be doing to get all the things you said that make New York great again?
The economy and fighting the pandemic go hand in hand. We have this, and I'm going to speak from my multiple hats for a second. We're a fairly low transmission area. Amazing, as terrible as it was, and we've all lost people and people still suffer. We're a fairly low transmission area, and our public health capacity was keeping us, and our social activities were keeping us at the same. As we bring back economic activity, educational activity, social activity, we need to make sure that our public health activities in the public sector are well managed. Testing, contact tracing, and isolation. You keep those together, you can actually elevate and escalate the economy, accelerate the economy, but it's both doing it from the governmental point of view and communicating it. Because right now, I've talked to, some of my members, you've talked to people. I talked to one who said, well, only 6% of his people are back at the office, and they're forbidding them to using public transit. I've communicated, the luxury of our positions is knowing people who have impact. And I've said, we need more enforcement, we need more signage, we need more encouragement, because people have to both be safe and know they're safe.
Right. Perception, you have to feel that you're okay.
Yeah, but it's the combination of being and feeling.
Right.
Illusion, one thing I've learned in public health emergency communications is, blowing smoke only lasts for a couple of days and it dissipates.
Right.
You have to have the reality behind it, both certainty and uncertainty. I think the governor did a tremendous job for that beginning of the pandemic. Communicating with people is tremendous, and actually taking actions. And that's why, in part that, and what the city's done, what the MTA has done, that's why we're where we're at. But we need to make sure that transportation works, that there's compliance and acceptance. And as cynical as New Yorkers are, you can go around and people are wearing masks. And they need to keep doing it. And we need access. Those are core. But then it really is, I think, some of the core functionings of government have to be smart and prudent on a day-to-day level. And our budgets, and we'll get into the budgets, but we really can, with the money available, still available, as hard as it is, we can, if the managers do it, the city leadership does it, labor comes to the table, we can actually provide services people need. So that goes hand in hand.
I agree. I think, look, in a time of crisis, people want to see streets clean. They want to feel safe. They want their trash picked up twice a week. They want kind of the basic things that, when things are great, we almost forget about because they happen. But when things are in trouble a little bit, we worry about. So here's my question. How bad is the budget? How bad are things? Citizens Budget Commission, clearly you understand this better than any of us do. Talk to us, Andrew. How bad are things, and then we'll talk about how we fix it.
If okay, I'm going to talk about the three entities I mentioned before.
Yeah.
The MTA is in very hard shape, very bad shape. In part, it's lost around $12 billion over 2 years of revenue. 50% of it comes from fare and tolls, and the bottom dropped out, as we know. Tolls are coming back quicker than people riding on the trains and the subways. Their other half comes from economically sensitive taxes, and those have dropped out. So the MTA has a great challenge because of its revenue structure and its cost of doing business and its flexibility. It can't raise taxes, it can't cut services so much without being devastated. Now it has to actually, we believe, right-size those services. Labor needs to come to the table, but it is in the worst shape. The second is probably the state because of its volatile revenue structure. The state lost $14.5 billion within this fiscal year from its projections. Now it's actually solved a lot of that budget problem, and the rest of it has contours of a plan without specifics. But the state's revenue structure is volatile, and they're in some really tough shape. The city is probably in the best shape, but it's still very, very hard. The city lost $9 billion over 16 months, $19 billion over 4 years of its financial plan projected resources. So the city's in a tough shape, but it actually, all three governments have choices they can make to make it better. The key is the willingness, the leadership, the management to make those choices. So the budgets are in bad shape, but they can be managed. But I think the other thing to think about is the risk. So you can, numbers on a spreadsheet are numbers on a spreadsheet, right? And the city's gaps, let's, for example, look kind of manageable, except what if the economy doesn't do as well as they project? Well, they have reasonably conservative economic forecasts, but uncertainty is the name of the game. The state fiscal problems roll downhill. And now the state has options, and CBC put out a report on those options and included in our report a set of options that wouldn't hit the city this year that hard. Will the state accept our proposals? We hope. But if it doesn't, the city could get a $1, $2, $3 billion hit potentially next year in its budget from state budget cuts. So it's the risk factor that's burdens all of us, and including spending not being reimbursed by the feds if it's higher than expected. Running schools this way is not a cheap endeavor. The Fed should pick up that bill. How much will they is still an open question.
Wow. Let's start with the MTA. The MTA is, what do they call it? The lifeblood, the lifeline of New York, the great equalizer of New York. I think the MTA leadership has worked very hard in the last 6 or 7 months. The chairman, their staff, their leadership. But you're right, they didn't have people riding the subways for a long time. So what does CBC say to the MTA? What should they be doing?
It was interesting. In March, we sat down and said, we can easily someone like the ideologues outside of government can stand on ceremony and say, oh, here's what you should do, pronouncements of all the stuff you can do. But we said, hold on, some of the things that we normally like to say are off the table, might have to be on the table. So our general rubric says you prioritize activities, but nothing's off the table because we are in that kind of situation. We shouldn't face a fiscal crisis, the worst in generations, by just blithely saying you can't do X or you can't do Y. So regarding the MTA, it's kind of a cascading, 4-part activities. First is to improve efficiency, and it's about labor being at the table, figuring out job descriptions, work rules, work crews, shifts, getting that right, as well as potentially contributions to health insurance that are higher than they've been historically. The MTA is still lower, although in the last round or 2 rounds ago, our contribution was increased. It's bringing labor to the table and increasing efficiencies. The second is scoping, looking at that capital plan and saying, what is essential? The MTA, as goes the MTA, essentially goes the region, as we're saying, the lifeblood. We can't come out of this with an MTA that cannot support the economy we need. On the other hand, the MTA's $54 billion capital plan plus 5-year capital plan proposed, plus the 15 billion or 14 billion of old capital plan that wasn't spent. That's $70 billion that we never thought the MTA could actually do in the 5 years. They got to pare down to essential state of good repair work, essential signaling. They might have to compromise on some of their accessibility problems because fiscally they cannot do everything. But they need to figure out what is essential for both the ridership now and for the economy to grow. That's got to be pared back. The third is, quite frankly, we probably need to optimize service levels to the ridership where it is. People aren't riding certain subway lines as much at certain times, and certainly not the commuter rails as much. As challenging as it is, we should be optimizing those service levels and saving money. And fourth, we might have to look at fares and tolls. Now, the MTA was really smart by saying, okay, let's do this every other year, because there's always, as we all know, this political battle, because no one ever wants to see, even though there's inflation, and cost increases, no one ever wants to see fares go up. By locking in, every other year, they were smart, but we might need to look at fares and tolls more. And two other things. One is there's a fair fares program, so it can be economically hard for lower income New Yorkers, and we have a program. We have to look at that as part of the fair discussion, as well as the fact that tolls have come back better. Bridge and tunnel ridership has come back. Drivership has come back more than subway ridership. Maybe you delink those because you'd get more money by delinking them. So they've got to look at that. After all those, can they still get there? Probably it's going to be a challenge. Do we look at long-term borrowing for operations? Do we look hopefully for federal aid? We do all those things first and we hope for federal aid. The challenge with long-term borrowing for operations, which the MTA is looking at and has $10 billion of potential authority, is that it costs you money in the future. And we know that the structure, we know that the budget was precariously balanced before this crisis. So hobbling the future with those kind of debt service bills will come with compromises. So we really, really have to make sure it's a last resort and consider what has to give in the long run if we do it.
All very interesting points. I want to take a minute, just talk on the capital part of it. Obviously, the people I represent, we're happy with 50 billion plus. They'd be happier with 100 billion plus, right? The reality is, what can we actually build? And I think one of the things we all together have to really look at is planning. And one of the things we as a city and maybe as government in general, federal, state, city, locals, don't always plan 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And this may be an opportunity to really plan and say, what do we need to get built now? What can wait a little bit? And what is more long-term? But we would argue strongly that a robust capital MTA plan and a robust city capital plan and state and feds is a way to jumpstart our economy, and we would obviously push that as hard as we can.
No, and I agree with both parts. The premise, as you say, of being smart about planning, because we have to make choices right now. Without planning, we make stupid choices. Right. And that's why I put in the context of what the economy needs, because that's part of, as you say, the long-term planning. Right. Geographically, volume-wise, we need to grow. We need to set ourselves up for growth. We just put out a paper on ways to spur housing production. Now's the time to do those things, to plan, to structure for growth. Couldn't agree more. And the planning is essential because we will have to make choices. We agree, obviously, the more we do, all else being equal, the better the growth is. The key is we have such limited resources. Let's focus on the right things so that we have a strong MTA capital program, a strong city capital program. We're building the right things for the economy and quite frankly, for the industry. Interestingly, I understand, as we said, $70 billion that was planned. The MTA, their throughput and capital commitments on any given year before this was, $5-6 billion. And they plan to do, I think, about 13 billion this year. Right now, I think they've committed around 3.6 billion, which is, certainly almost a little above half of what they had planned throughout the year. And there was a lot packed into the end of the year. It's probably falling off the table, but we'll have to see. But I couldn't agree more that if we hobble the MTA's capacity, coming out of this will hobble the region's economic capacity.
Right. We agree, and that's why I think in the federal stimulus, whatever comes out of it, a real fundamental financial commitment to the MTA is critical. And I think if you look at the latest Democrat House proposal that Speaker Pelosi put out, I think it was yesterday or the day before, there is a significant chunk for mass transit across the nation.
And might I just add, the governments are all intertwined.
Yes.
As I mentioned before, the state's fiscal stress passes down to the city. The MTA's fiscal stress can pass up to the state and a little to the city. They're all intertwined. If you're looking at the city budget, as I said, they're in very challenging shape, but they have some options. If they can work with labor better than they have, quite frankly, they have some options, as long as the state doesn't make it harder. So if you help the state, the city can get that, relief from that risk and be in a better position.
So let's move to this. We're going to hold the city and borrowing for a little bit, but let's talk about the feds for a minute. So the governor has been very clear in his ask of the federal government, of Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand, of course, of the president. What do you think is going on? Do you think we're going to see some real dollars to the state, which is then going to go to the city and the MTA and the Port Authority and all of that? Or is this just going to wait till February when we have a new president sworn in?
Yeah. Everyone who sits in our seats and makes prediction now, when they're right, everyone looks
Right.
that they were smart in retrospect, and when they were wrong, they're just, part of the crowd. I don't have any, special crystal ball, but I, like you, follow these things intently because they matter. There's discussions right now. They might actually bear fruit, shockingly, but they could not. Prevailing wisdom that if there is a, Democratic sweep of the Senate and the president, that there will be more, I think is reasonable. The question is, do either of those things happen, and how much and when the stimulus is really matters. I also believe that even under the most reasonably optimistic scenarios, there is still pain with all three of these entities, and they can be making and have to be making choices, so they should make them now, because the longer you delay, the worse it is. Even if they don't have to make all the painful choices they would have to otherwise, because the feds come through with something, they still need to take actions today. And one of the things that we've said about, all the governments is they need to get real. And there are issues in all of them where they haven't really laid out what they need to do and what they should be doing, in part because they want the federal stimulus. I will say, I think it was Pat Foy at the MTA a couple of months ago finally put out this list, and everyone was shocked and said, "Whoa, is this what you're talking about in terms of services and fares and all that stuff?" That's what reality is. So it's good to have that discussion. But I'm hopeful on the stimulus. I'm cautiously optimistic.
I am also. I think the last, at least from what I'm being told, the last 15 to 24 hours, something good may be happening.
But the rub of the difference, in part, is that public sector piece.
Correct.
So what hangs in the balance between, the House is 500 and the White House is 250 might be this piece.
Correct. But look, if the MTA gets a good chunk and the state gets and the city gets, we may not get 100%, but we'll at least be on the road to a good recovery.
But the other thing, let me just say, whether any one-time infusion, we have to make sure it's a bridge and not a prop. If you prop up a system that you cannot afford in the long run, we're just kicking the can down the road, and sometimes cans get bigger, they snowball. Maybe I'm mixing metaphors too much. But you do that. So whatever it is, whatever strategy, the one-time strategy is, and it can even be boring, it's got to be a bridge, not a prop. We will not get the full, ad infinitum forever support. We need to make sure that we restructure these governments in the right way to focus on priorities so that when we come out of this, we're strong.
So, we should talk about borrowing in a minute, but I meant to ask this earlier. So your organization really understands budgets and crisis and deficits better than all of us do. Where would you place where we are now? Are we like we were after World War II? Are we like we were after the Great Depression? Are we the 70s? Are we September 12th, 2001? Are we 2008? You know, because you hear we're in the worst fiscal crisis. Well, we're not that bad. Where are we really? I think people want to know where really are we?
So let's use let's not go back to the war. Let's use the fiscal crisis, 70s, and the last two recessions, and let's use the 70s as a benchmark. In the 70s, the city, we had a change in our economy nationally, with manufacturing declining, manufacturing moving from what was called the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. There were long-term issues, and the city had a long-term fiscal problem where it was borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. Before it started the year, it was already borrowing, for what extent. And it didn't have financial controls. In that way, we are not in the 70s. We have better financial controls. We have been borrowing to fund our operations. Alternatively, though, we squandered the recovery of the last 10 years. We put away some in reserves, but probably half of what we could have. And we built the size of our government so much that turning this around is really tough. And the gaps are really big because we didn't prepare. And we're not in the 70s, but if we start to borrow and use it as a prop and not a bridge, and the mayor's talked about borrowing for $1 billion of savings that he committed to in his budget. He committed on July 1st to $1 billion of savings with labor. Frankly, 4 months into the crisis, I think he should have had a plan, not just a commitment. But 2 months later, he said, I got nothing. He didn't come back and say, labor and I worked out half of it. So if we borrow for that, and last week he said, well, we need to borrow for the $1 billion that was in the budget and the $1 billion for next year. And I start to hear the same borrowing again and again, and then I start to think about the 70s. So are we in that structure? We're better set up, but we have to watch that slippery slope. But also the difference in the 70s, the state was in a position to help the city that it's not now. And the state is in fiscal crisis, and that is a very different situation. So from the state's perspective, it's worse. From the city's perspective, it's better, but the risk is worse. The MTA, it's hard to compare, but it's a major crisis. We were turning the corner. We had a precariously balanced budget. Everything had to be right. When you look at that January MTA budget, as a January, February plan, you look at that budget, it was precariously balanced. The restructuring plan, the budget alignment plan, it counted on money from the city for additional subsidies that it hadn't had in this budget. But it was precariously balanced, but turning a corner operationally and had a capital plan. But it needed that capital plan because we were starting to deteriorate. The subways could deteriorate more. You don't want to come out of this like the 70s. In terms of, if you look at the recessions from the last two, Great Recession and in 2001, this is much worse because it is a global, this was a shutdown of the economy. And it was kind of like a Katrina, but globally. So everyone's supply chains were cut. Everything really changed. And the retail market, the bottom was dropped out of a retail market that already was in transition. So there's a lot worse in that case, but we need to attack it with just as much vigor as we attack those crises, and we're not really there yet.
You mentioned the rainy day fund. For the viewers that don't know much about that, give us a quick, how much do we have in the, and hidden under the mattress that we can pull out right now and spend?
Well, I have to, without getting in too wonky, technically, until this year, the city couldn't have a technical real rainy day fund because of all that good accounting that was set up in the 70s after the fiscal crisis. It did everything right except stop the city from having a real rainy day fund. So the city worked around and put money in this pot and that pot. But hopefully when we come out of this, we will have that rainy day fund and we will do much better in the future. Although it depends right now, the way it's structured, on the city leaders' willingness to fund that fund. So we need to work on that, but we'll leave that for until we get out of this crisis. The city put away around $6 billion during this crisis. Now, it's a big number relative to history, depending how you count it. It's close to the largest it is. I would argue it's not the largest it is, but it was larger. But frankly, when we did our analyses of rainy day funds, we thought it should have twice as much, and it could have had twice as much. Imagine, of course, what a rainy day fund is, you sock away a little money every year, right? You have a bank account. All of us think that we should sock away a little money every year, whether we do it or not. But if you sock it away, you don't spend it now. Imagine the concept if the city had socked away another $4 or $5 billion and the city budget was actually $2 billion less than it was now. That's a $7 billion swing. And that $2 billion is on a recurring basis. We would have a totally different conversation now. The city had around $6 billion. The state had money and has money in all sorts of corners. It's amazing. They don't have the fiscal control. So it's a little harder to understand. They had around $5 billion socked away. They have a $3 billion in a rainy day fund and a couple of other pots. Now the state's budget is $106 billion of state funding, $185 billion of all funds. It should have had a much larger rainy day fund, maybe almost 2.5 times what it had. So it needs to build that up in the good times as well.
So, there are people that will say, well, look, if the city has $6 billion in a rainy day fund, just take $2 or $3 billion out of it and pay your bills for a year, and don't lay people off and continue to build schools and sewers and pave the roads. I know Polly Trottenberg is, I think she's watching, but I know
I saw Polly's name. Hello.
Hi, Polly. I know Polly's been working hard with pavings and everything. So like people will say, come on, just take $2 billion out. Go under the mattress, get your money and spend it.
But they're right, and that's what the city did. Right. So the city had $6 billion and it used $4 billion to balance this year's budget. It used $2 billion. It used $2 billion of federal money, $4 billion of its reserves, of its $6 billion reserves. It had a savings plan. But even after all that, it's got big problems in the future and big risks in the future. So they're exactly right. This is the rainy day. On the other hand, the state, we'll see what the state does. Amazingly, the state passed a budget where the spending was $10 billion more than the revenue. I'll call it a budget, but it's hard for a budgeteer to call a budget where one side is that much, the revenue side is that much under the spending to call it really a budget. And the governor's strategy has said, hold on, let's wait till we see about federal aid. But the strategy has also been to withhold local aid because it might need to make a big cut. It has an $8 billion amorphous cut. And so they're withholding money, which of course is leaving school districts, nonprofits, local governments, including New York City, in the lurch, not knowing if the money that the state's not giving them now is actually going to be a cut or they'll get it back later. And we've urged the state to have a plan. The challenge is when we put out our plan, we looked at what the state was doing and it has reserves that it's not using. And so now it has a multi-year problem and so does the city. So you can use those reserves over time, but now is the rainy day. We shouldn't be hoarding them. As long as those reserves are used as part of a bridge, we should be using them.
So it sounds like it's more than raining right now. It sounds like it's
pouring. It's
pouring.
torrential.
It's probably close to hurricane season from the way it seems. So the mayor is asking and has talked about it many times, authority from the state to borrow X billions of dollars. And I know you guys have a very clear position on that. And I think it's important that we talk about the borrowing. And I should add, if any of our listeners or viewers have questions, you can type it in the Q&A box. But Andrew, let's talk about budgeting, about borrowing, sorry.
As I said, we came in the beginning of this crisis and said, we're, borrowing for operations should be a last resort if ever. Because what happens is 3 things. You might prop up spending that you can't really afford and you just kick the can or start a snowball. You burden our children with paying our bills. And that violates, what the budgeteers call intergenerational equity, but just it ain't fair. I mean, this is a crisis of potentially, a generation or a lifetime. So you might consider it, but you have to consider the equity over time of having someone else pay for your bills today. But the other thing is, as they pay for those bills, they can't pay for their own bills. So they either have, less services or higher taxes. And that hampers New York's competitiveness as an attractive place. So those negative effects, the fact that you have to, the fact that you might prop up spending, that someone else has to pay your bills, that you're going to hamper competitiveness. And remember, borrowing, even a low interest rate, has interest. You pay back more over time. That's how it works. With all those negative effects, you really have to have it at the end of your chain and do everything else first. The mayor has gone to Albany 3 times in the last 5 months to ask for authority to borrowing. First $7 billion, and the last 2 times $5 billion. What it is exactly for has not always been well articulated or consistently well articulated, but it's to cover those budget gaps so that we don't have to do the cuts. And what the mayor has said now is he'd like to use the first $1 billion to cover the $1 billion of savings that he committed to in his budget but hasn't delivered with labor. Our position, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's not a never say never position because we are in that kind of crisis, and I think that's important. But the 4 components, there are conditions. The first is you do all the savings that you committed to in your budget, you annualize those so they recur in the long run. There's the savings plan in the budget, there's a lot of upfront savings, which is real money. But if you don't save money over time, you just, again, kicking the can down the road. Hey, we're in a pandemic. They didn't run summer school. They saved money on summer school busing. Great. But that doesn't help you next year. So you need to save what's in the budget and annualize it over time. Then you need to have authority only what you need in the next year and only if the revenues come in worse, because we think the city can manage, as long as those risks don't come through and the revenues hold what they projected, they think we can manage. So only if the situation gets worse than it is now should you borrow. Third, any borrowing authority should come with a multi-year fiscal stability plan. How are you going to substitute in the future for those borrowed funds? If you borrow $1 billion now, what happens next year? What's your plan? Are you going to cut? Are you going to raise revenues? Now we have different opinions, but what are you going to do? Or is the economy in the 3rd or 4th year going to come back? What is your plan to use borrowing as that bridge? And it needs to have the city would need to have a fiscal stability plan, or any government. And in the case of New York City, we've said that the Financial Control Board, which was created after the 70s fiscal crisis, and now is just functionally a monitoring board, but it should be empowered to say whether that multi-year plan is actually valid and feasible. Fake plans aren't really worth anything. We need an external monitor to say that's feasible. And fourth, that the Financial Control Board, the FCB, should monitor implementation of the plan, should approve every instance of borrowing so that it's in line with that plan and not superfluous and just used for some other purposes, and have a say over major decisions that have financial implications, which is kind of a control period, depending how it's structured, like it was in the 70s. But if we are at that place where we're going to borrow, where we are at this place because we haven't made the choices we need to thus far, we need some kind of monitoring, and that's our position.
Right, and I think that is, I think we're going to have to make some decisions soon if the talks in the next day or two in Washington really just fall apart. So I think we're kind of at the end of the road with that. I'd be curious to get your organization's take on the capital budget for New York City. Again, obviously the members that I represent are interested in a very robust New York City capital budget. Several agencies have put a hold on various planning and projects for the future. We don't think that that's a good thing for the economy, particularly in 2021, 22, and 23. And I think it all ties together, but capital budgets are a little different, right? And the borrowing authority and long-term debt and everything. So, I'd be curious to talk a little bit about the capital budget for you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And if I wasn't clear on my distinction, I just want to reiterate it because Carlo, you're exactly right.
You and I are wonks on this, but a lot of people kind of hear borrowing and they.
Yeah, I was talking about borrowing for current operations.
Operating, right.
No question. Borrowing, part of our recommendation for the state. The state does a lot of pay-as-you-go capital spending. They should, especially now. It's good to do pay-as-you-go capital when you have money, you don't issue debt, that's great. But if you're going to borrow for anything, you should borrow for capital. Things have long, useful lives. It's fair. Remember intergenerational equity, as I said, it is fair. It is right for people to pay over time. Fiscally, it's good to get a little ahead of the game with pay-as-you-go capital, but it is totally reasonable. So that whole discussion about city borrowing was about borrowing for operating expenses, which is the challenge. for capital, it is appropriate in the city. I come back to what you said. We need to plan for what we really need, since we won't be able to do everything we can. We are fortunate for perspective about the city's capital budget has certainly increased in recent years. So when we talk about rolling back, when the city talks about rolling back, its commitment plan, it basically, it reduced its near-term commitment plan. Most of it pushed to the future. Some things were cut, but most of it was pushed to the future. But we still are talking about a commitment level that is more like 2017 than 2019, which had grown a lot. I'm not saying that, obviously, from your members' point of view and people who are involved in the industry, they would like it to be at that level, but they haven't pared it back at this point to, a much smaller capital plan than historically. What obviously kind of got lost in the shuffle or temporarily delayed or pushed out were projects like, the prisons, like some of the SCA work, in the design phase.
Mhm.
So that was put on hold, and then there was also some housing work, like some of the capital subsidies. What happens there is they liquidate immediately. So when the city is worried about cash, which it was certainly in the beginning of this crisis, they said, "Hold on, I gotta manage cash because I gotta be able to pay my bills." Which, if you're on the other side of that choice, I understand. On the other side, the city was right to manage cash right away. And one of the things early on, I talked to the budget director, and she described the first thing she did was make sure she could pay her bills and was managing cash, which is right. What's good is that the city's cash position is better than it was. The interest rates are low. They're still paying a slight premium above AAA, but they still have access at low interest rates. So we'll see what happens, because a new capital plan is going to be coming out fairly soon. I think you're exactly right. We need to plan and prioritize and see what it is. Will it be as robust as what they had planned before? I would doubt it. I think by historical standards, it will be reasonably robust. And if they plan well, they can do the right things for the economy and the right things, for those projects. And I'm hopeful on that. But again, you have to make those hard choices. And it's always hard when you sit in their seats, to make those choices. But I'm hopeful that it's at a reasonable level, because we can't stop doing the things we need to do. We just have to focus on the essentials, whether it's the capital budget, and I'm not trying to divert away from that, or services. Now is the time to focus on what's really important. And we can't do everything now, but if they do that right, they have the money, they should have the money to do that. And again, part of that limit will be on whatever federal package or what happens with the state. But again, it all comes back, because, from the debt service point of view, it's all in the operating budget. So the more efficient the services are delivered, the more labor comes to the table on efficiencies, the more they will be able to afford their capital budget as well. So it all ties together about making those choices.
If you had a crystal ball and, it was now January 7th or January 8th, where do you think we are as a city and a state? Have we turned the corner by then? Are we still having these discussions? Are we in a better place?
I think there are two things. One is, it depends what the leadership does. And by that's not to punt on the question, but to put the point that we control a chunk of our destiny.
Right.
I think we've recommended that the governor actually put out a plan for a budget balancing plan, which he hasn't done yet. It's hard to see the crystal ball without what that plan looks like. That plan depends a lot on federal aid, and that's what the governor said. If you pick up the check, when the bill comes, I think he said this yesterday, I like this, so I share with whoever wasn't watching the governor. He said, when they put the check down on the table, if you touch it first, it's your bill. So he doesn't want to touch it until the feds do. It was a great analogy. I got to use work.
That's a great one.
But I think if the state makes the right choices on restructuring its capital program, as we think it should, at targeting its cuts to wealthy school districts that can afford it rather than poor school districts, all those things, we can be in decent shape. And those decisions in the future depend on the feds. Same with the city. And with the city, a lot of it's the mayor working with labor to find the savings. There's more money there and we don't have to go into service cuts that really damage people. But the mayor needs to work with labor on that. And if he does that well, we can be in a better place. And of course, as we said, there's hope. There's an assumption that under a Democratic sweep of the Senate and the presidency, that there would be more money that would come. Of course, no one will know January 7th what that is. I mean, this whole crystal ball about, the election, the world doesn't change in November. Money doesn't start flowing in November. I mean, we can go, we've talked a lot about, in the national dialogue about vaccine development, but then how do you distribute? The city's not going to get federal aid, from a new administration, in November, because that new administration is not sat until January 20th. So
it's going to take time after that.
So a lot of it depends on making those choices, and I think we can be in decent shape. But the other thing depends, going back to where we started, it's about controlling the pandemic so we can have more expanded economic activity, and that's what we all want.
Right. I think it's we're almost out of time, but it's a good kind of segue to the last couple of minutes, which is once we feel safe and we're back to work and the economy's open and Broadway reopens and tourism is back and offices are full again, I think obviously tax receipts will grow and the economy gets better and more people are on mass transit and subways, et cetera. And I think we have a better kind of focus into 2021. The other thing I think people have to remember is even if there is a Democratic president sworn in what is it, January 20th, and a Democratic controlled Senate, there are going to be a lot of states with their hands out to President Biden and to presumably Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. So while New York, we would hope we would get the most, there are going to be a lot of other swing state senators who are going to be up for re-election who are going to say, well, folks, I'm a moderate Democrat. I need money too, and my state needs money. And so I'm not sure that just that action will give us the money we need. I think we have to focus on, we are, a large state. We are the economic engine of this country. Any other country in the world, if their version of New York City went through what we did and is such a powerhouse in the economics of the country, they would be focused on us and really focused on, well, we got to save New York City and we have to get them the resources and everything. In the US, we think differently. Well, New York is, they're big enough, they can handle it. But this is a moment where New York we need our own money back from the federal government. That's the bottom line.
Yes, no, I mean, there is the balance of payments discussion. Yeah. I worked in Washington for 4 years. I confess to being asked much more about what we were doing for poor people in Montana than in Brooklyn, where we live. It's always a challenge. It feels like both a powerhouse and we've got a great delegation, but also an underdog. It's how it is. I will also say a lot of this, the world will be different. The world, the economy will be different. We know that telecommuting will be more of a norm, but we don't know how much and how it will affect office space. What we're learning now, as people have gotten into this, is, okay, we rode on our momentum and our people, but do we have the creative ideas that happen when people get together? Can we do the business development? Can we hire new people? So there will be changes, but it's not like it's now, but we don't know how that looks. But we know that people want to come back, want to interact, so we've got to make those choices that not only stable the finances, of course, as CDC is concerned, but also set the stage for infrastructure, for social infrastructure, to be that dynamic place, because we can never really predict what the future of New York looks like. But if we set the stage right, we will have new great things happen. Would we have predicted after 9/11 that we would be a technology powerhouse? No, but we have the dynamism. We just have to make sure we make the choices that preserve our ability to have that dynamism as retail changes, as office use changes, as we get through the stress that people have with rents and small landlords. We have to make sure we get through that right.
And I would argue, and it may sound a little self-serving given the organization that I run, but I would argue that building and creating and looking at how we're going to build differently, and we're going to build more open spaces and more unique workspaces, and creative retail environments. And even during a global pandemic, Facebook signed a lease to be in Midtown West, and Google is still building, right? And Amazon took 1 million square feet or something like that, and the Brooklyn housing market is still strong, and we're still going to build, we're still going to rebuild Penn Station and everything that goes with it. So there are a lot of success stories out of it. And I think if all of us just kind of come together and just look forward, I think we're still going to do great. But as you said, it's going to be a different great, and it's going to look different. And we don't know what's the next industry that comes out of this. On March, I guess it was March 12th, I had never heard of Zoom. And I mean that. And someone said to me, we need to set you up with Zoom because we don't know what's happening next. And I had no clue what they were talking about. And here we are, with 100-something people talking together on a Zoom call, right? Who knows what the Zoom of 2021 will be?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And it's about us coming together, and it's about the leadership, and it's about the management, and it's about people looking towards the future and setting up the right stage, all those infrastructure, and I mean that obviously physical, but also social, economic, and safety and health. We have that. New York has been this dynamic, great place throughout history for hundreds of years, not just in our lifetimes, even though I'm getting older. But it really is that, but it depends on us.
I agree. Well, I think this is a great place to stop the discussion, although it sounds like we could really talk for hours, but we won't bore everybody. Andrew Rein, Citizen Budget Commission, really thank you for what you do personally, but for what CBC does. I know you are a very critical fabric of our city and of our state, and in moments like this, the CBC becomes even more critical. So we thank you.
Well, thank you, Carlo, and thank all your members for what they're doing every day, keeping us going and keeping us growing.
Thank you. And Bravo, again, our sponsor, EHAB, thank you. And we will see you at our next Espresso with Carlo. We will be announcing it very, very shortly, but it will be with Attorney General Letitia James in less than a week. So stay tuned for an announcement. Have a great day, everybody. Keep strong. New York will always be, at least in my opinion, the center of the universe. Andrew, I think you'll agree with that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.